One thing that is very interesting about the epidemic or pandemic is that it is also one that happens at a very peculiar time in modernity. It's the time when the laboratory is introduced into medicine and research. It's the time when new concepts of hygiene are being pushed very, very forcefully, especially into the Western world. It's the time of the empires. It's also the time of the failure of many of the empires. It's the time of the beginning of capitalism, when global trade really takes on. And at the midst of this, you have this ancient medieval disease returning and threatening really the fabric of all of it.
The Plague.text project is an interdisciplinary project with medical historians and computer scientists, and the idea is to analyze over 100 plague reports which were written about the third plague epidemic, which happened at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, and it affected the whole world. The idea is to basically automatically pull out information from those reports to be able to study them as a collection rather than as individual documents. It's not meant to replace, human analysis whatsoever. It's kind of trying to find hidden knowledge in those kind of collections and making them more accessible, basically. It's like trying to find this common ground and be able to do something useful with the tools that can help.
Epidemiology didn't really exist at that time. From the mid-19th century until the early 20th century, epidemiology was a state practice. It was really something that state officials did to carry out observation and counting and accounting for threats to their population, and also to account for the amounts of disease. Although we think of epidemiology as something that is very much based on mathematical methods today, at that time it's a highly interdisciplinary endeavor. They would use everything available in terms of knowledge to try to explain why disease is happening. And that would as much relate to the hygienic state of the streets as much as it would relate to the living conditions of certain parts of the population. Also, it would kind of relate to weather and climate questions, or just to the relationship of how humans live with certain animals. So all these questions kind of merge together in that what then becomes epidemiology. And it's really later, in the 1920s and onwards, I would say, that this overwhelming complexity of interdependent variables becomes something that then is more and more tuned towards mathematical modeling. But at that time when plague is happening, it is a narrative science, reported stories about plagues. You would relate this history to the larger history of plague, how it always has been and how it always has occurred in this or in that way.
What text mining allows is to do distant reading of collections, so basically to pull out information from a large body of text, which a human wouldn't necessarily be able to all read at once, and then be able to point the reader at the things that are of interest. So then that would help them to basically navigate through a collection. So this is what is often referred to as distant reading, but where the idea is really to kind of pull out information that is of interest, and then let the reader kind of drill into the detail once they've figured out where they want to go.
What we want to end up with is to have some kind of database or some kind of a collection of all arguments about causes that have been made in different places for different outbreaks. And then to be able to compare really how these arguments of cause are being made in different ways. Causation is especially interesting because causation is something that is in the following years or in the following decades something that epidemiology begins to shy away from, and to think much more about correlation instead.
In the longer term, we want to analyze the texts by zones. So, for example, a section which is just about the outbreak history, or a section which is just about the cases that were found in the city. And then how do can we pull out statistics about what happened in the city just for those specific sections, which makes it more specific.
Plague returns with a devastating outbreak in 1894 in Hong Kong, at a time when this outbreak at that time really pushed the image in everyone's mind who was concerned about that there is a huge global vulnerability to an infectious disease like that. And of course, we then have to reconsider that the idea of infection The idea of infection through a pathogen is something that was just 20, 25, 30 years old at that time. The big question that how did the bacteria get into human bodies? Why is it ever developing into a devastating epidemic? What role do animal vectors play in the distribution of disease? As a likely hypothesis that rats might be involved, and that rephrases the whole or reshapes the whole idea of how contagion works, of how transmission of a disease works. It's this whole shifting image of the rat that merges with the development of plague really on the global scale, but also it's this gaining authority of laboratory science that is vastly challenged by plague. Because the laboratory could identify the bacteria, it could argue that the bacteria was causing the disease, but it could not identify how the bacteria was getting into human bodies and how it would cause many diseases in a place. And this is where epidemiologists really came in and trying to how can we, if we know the characteristic of the individual case, if we know the cause of the disease, what are the circumstances? What are the environmental, social, cultural circumstances that make this disease an epidemic?
So the plague.txt project is important because no one has yet looked at all of the plague reports from this third epidemic in a collection. So we can do a big data analysis essentially of all the text that is relevant to this epidemic that was published around that time. And by combining the text analysis and the visualization, we can basically make this data more accessible for research. Throughout the world, I think in the case of plague, it was most of the time Chinese populations that were blamed. While you have some who say very freely that there is something inherent in the lifestyle or the biological nature of Chinese populations that might make them particularly vulnerable to plague. You have others who really are trying to flag up the inherent danger of racist stupidity. To assume that simply by isolating Chinese populations in San Francisco, which is what happened when plague arrived in San Francisco, to assume that that would prove safe to the rest of the population is to fall prey to an understanding of diseases that is ancient, that has been overcome by scientific understandings of disease, and instead one needs to turn to hygiene and to develop a different kind of understanding of how our environment needs to be structured. We treat the text as data, basically. So when they were written, they were in printed form and you couldn't analyze them automatically like that because, they were books basically, or reports inside books. And so what we do in the project is turn them into electronic text. So we take the scanned images of the reports and improve the character recognition to be able to analyze the text automatically. So basically the printed documents are turned into bits of data, and that's how we can try and explore those kind of collections using natural language processing technology. So basically we analyze each text first using an information extraction tool which is developed at the Language Technology Group in Edinburgh. And so we first identify information like person names, location names, but also terms that are relevant to plague. It's a way of making collections more accessible to people who didn't know they existed or weren't able to search them automatically or to analyze them via library interfaces and so on. And also to visualize information differently because previously these reports just existed in isolation, and now as a collection you can do much more interesting things in terms of visualizing the text.
This phenomenon or this thing called digital epidemiology, sometimes called infodemiology or computational epidemiology, but very much an endeavor of using epidemiological methods to look at data that has never been produced as medical data, that was never intended to be medical data, simply the way people interact with technology online in the broadest sense, the way people use wearable devices, the way people use their smartphone. All this information all of a sudden can be repurposed into epidemiological information. We can learn from Wikipedia access logs of how many people engage with the question of a certain disease that they are looking forwards and that they did find through Google searches. Applying a digital humanities lens to a text corpus is almost like a heuristic device to look at this text in a different way and to tease out ways in which this source material might be able to challenge your initial assumption simply by being able to look at it at scale. And in that process, I think we learn the most about the kind of questions that we want to ask. With these methods that are used to track or to develop understanding about epidemics in digital information, you can treat traces of a flu outbreak with the same tools and with the same instruments as you would treat the tracking of anti-vaccine sentiment. Yeah? And epidemiologists are doing that already. So yet again, this is a question of what is an epidemic object? What is an object that is called as an epidemic? And I think we see at the moment, we are in a time in which this is constantly being expanded and brought out. And I think in that way, I find contagion a very interesting metaphor to think about interdisciplinary working, or to think about the Futures Institute, or to think about things as something that is, by definition, a process that is characterized by a loss of control and characterized by an uncertainty that it brings in, because it is a concept that is precisely uncontained in its distribution. And that makes it an interesting process because it demands the creation of knowledge.